In a world trained to measure a woman's worth by how desired she is, the body's silence is treated like a diagnosis. It's no appetite for the usual games. The outside world calls it emptiness, proof that something is missing, or emotional failure. But Jungian psychology points to a darker, stranger truth. When the body goes quiet, it is not always a collapse. Sometimes it is a withdrawal of psychic energy from the surface of life, an instinctive refusal to keep bleeding meaning into people who cannot hold it. The libido doesn't disappear, it changes direction, and what it stops feeding on the outside, it begins to cultivate in the underground. This is why abstinence can feel like grief before it feels like clarity. The ego panics when it loses its fastest anesthesia. The nervous system trembles when the old validation supply dries up. And in that raw space, where loneliness first looks like punishment, something else begins to move: vivid dreams, sharpened intuition, an intolerance for half-love, a terrifying ability to see through masks. Society fears this phase for one reason: a woman who no longer needs to be chosen becomes impossible to control. In Jung's psychology, the force moving behind desire is larger than sex and far older than modern language. He called it libido, not as a moral problem to suppress, but as psychic energy, the life drive that seeks, reaches, bonds, creates, and insists on meaning. It is the current that animates attraction, but also ambition, curiosity, artistry, and the hunger to feel real in the presence of another. When libido is constantly pulled outward, toward attention, touch, validation, and the quick relief of being wanted, the inner world often becomes thin. Not because the soul is weak, but because it is crowded out. The unconscious does not stop speaking, it simply loses the room to be heard. Noise becomes a substitute for intimacy, stimulation becomes a substitute for self-contact, and the deepest signals get buried under the urgency to feel chosen. When libido retracts inward, something strange begins to happen. Silence appears, and the culture misreads it as failure. Yet what looks like lack can be the psyche clearing a space to reorganize. A body that stops participating in immediate pleasure is not automatically deprived. Energy that once leaked into repetitive loops can begin to collect, as if the system is refusing to spend itself on what no longer nourishes. This is not sanctimony, it is economy. The psyche becomes less interested in transactions that offer a temporary high and more interested in structures that can hold a life. Jung warned that what is denied returns as fate. The hunger to be desired, the need to be selected, the craving for external confirmation can become an invisible appetite that shapes choices while pretending to be love. It pulls the same type of partner, the same emotional rhythm, the same familiar wound dressed in new clothing. It repeats not because the person is foolish, but because the unconscious is loyal to what it knows. Abstinence, whether chosen consciously or arrived at through exhaustion, can interrupt that machinery. The circuit breaks, the old anesthesia becomes unavailable. In that interruption, the soul gains air. This is why the first phase can feel like grief. The ego does not celebrate the loss of its coping mechanisms. It panics. It calls the silence emptiness. It invents stories about wasted time, fading youth, missed chances. Beneath those stories is a more primal experience, the nervous system losing a familiar exit. Touch, pursuit, and romantic intensity can function like a pressure valve. When the valve closes, pressure rises, and the person meets what was previously avoided. On the surface, that encounter feels like discomfort. Beneath the surface, it is initiation. The inward door opens because there is finally space behind it. During periods of abstinence, many people notice shifts that can feel almost supernatural. Dreams become more vivid, intuition sharpens, sensitivity increases, and the tolerance for half-truths decreases. The psyche, no longer flooded with external stimulation, begins translating itself with more volume. The inner world, previously muted, starts insisting. This sensitivity is frequently misunderstood as fragility. It is not weakness to feel more, it is a different orientation of attention. A radar that was once trained to scan for approval starts scanning for meaning. Subtle inconsistencies become visible. Emotional patterns in others become easier to read. The performance of romance begins to look like choreography. What was once intoxicating starts to feel repetitive, even cheap, because the psyche has stopped accepting imitation as nourishment. When libido is no longer compelled to spend itself on external reassurance, begins flowing into other channels: memory, imagination, creativity, reflection, and the capacity to stand alone without collapsing into self-abandonment. The person begins to discover that aloneness and loneliness are not the same substance. One is a condition, the other is a wound. Abstinence does not magically heal the wound, but it removes a common distraction, forcing the wound into visibility where it can finally be addressed. That visibility reveals an uncomfortable truth: dependence on the gaze. Not always obvious, not always conscious, and often disguised as just wanting love. The ego tends to narrate itself as refined and intentional. And the unconscious? It delivers evidence. Flirtation becomes dull. Conversations that once felt exciting start sounding like loops. Certain doors close without effort, not through arrogance, but because something inside stops tolerating counterfeit connection. The psyche becomes less available to what merely mirrors desire and more aligned with what carries substance. In the deeper layer, a question begins forming, not as a dramatic confession, but as a quiet pressure that will not go away. What was being sought in intimacy, in touch, in the relief of being chosen? Love or sedation? Communion or escape? The body's silence can be the first honest answer. There is a social truth rarely stated without disguise. Modern culture often turns a woman's body into a public report card. Desire becomes a metric. Attention becomes a currency. Being wanted is treated like evidence of being alive, and having someone beside her is treated like proof that she is acceptable. These standards do not live only in billboards or entertainment. They leak into families, friend groups, dating advice, and the inner voice that quietly keeps score at night. This is why withdrawal creates friction. When a woman steps out of the validation economy, whether through abstinence, solitude, or a simple refusal to perform, she interrupts a system that depends on her participation. The unsettling part is not her loneliness. The unsettling part is that she becomes difficult to measure. A person who is still hungry can be guided with bait. A person who fears being left can be negotiated into compromises that slowly hollow them out. A person addicted to being desired can confuse intimacy with transaction, mistaking attention for love and touch for value. These are not moral failures. They are predictable adaptations inside a culture that rewards visible desirability and punishes quiet self-possession. When libido retracts inward and learns to live without constant confirmation, a different kind of power begins to form. Power that does not announce itself, does not chase, does not bargain. It is the authority of self-regulation, the ability to sit in silence without immediately turning the silence into a hunt. It is the ability to feel the ache without making someone else responsible for numbing it. It is the ability to stop converting the body into a billboard for worth. Here the deepest paradox appears. Society praises independence in theory, but often resists independence in practice. It applauds the aesthetic of self-sufficiency, busy schedules, curated confidence, financial competence, because those forms remain legible and non-threatening. Yet real independence is quieter and more disruptive. It is not simply the capacity to survive alone, it is the refusal to require a witness in order to exist. That refusal destabilizes familiar dynamics. People who are still living by the old economy sense the shift even if they cannot name it. A woman who no longer needs to be chosen stops broadcasting need, and need is one of the easiest signals to exploit. She stops negotiating her standards down to secure proximity. She stops accepting almost as if it were intimacy. In that moment, she becomes less available to manipulation, not because she is hardened, but because she is no longer bribed by crumbs of attention. The system responds the way systems often respond to non-compliance, with discomfort disguised as concern. Advice arrives too quickly, as if silence must be treated as an emergency. Subtle mockery appears, framed as humor, because ridicule is a social tool for pulling someone back into line. Worry shows up wearing the costume of care, insisting that withdrawal is unhealthy, that abstinence is regression, that solitude is a symptom. The hidden demand beneath these reactions is simple. Return to the surface where everything is predictable, where desire can be quantified, where roles are clear, and where the absence of performance does not force others to confront their own dependence. What looks like a personal choice therefore becomes a quiet revolt, not a loud rebellion, not a moral statement, but a refusal to keep paying the price of belonging. Abstinence can function as a boundary not only around sex, but around the entire machinery of proving. And once the psyche begins to taste that kind of freedom, the old incentives lose their power. The world calls it withdrawal. The deeper truth is that the world is losing access to a lever it once pulled without resistance. If abstinence is sold as instant peace, it becomes a cheap slogan. The psyche rarely transforms through comfort. It transforms through exposure, through the sudden removal of whatever used to soften the edges of inner life. Abstinence does not merely reduce distraction, it takes away a familiar method of relief. When that relief is gone, the personality is forced into contact with what it has been avoiding, and that is where the descent begins. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not a dramatic monster hiding in the basement. It is the rejected part of the self that was exiled for the sake of acceptance. It contains what once threatened belonging, anger that felt too much, need that felt humiliating, desire that seemed dangerous, ambition that appeared unfeminine, even tenderness that once led to disappointment. The shadow is not the worst in a person, it is the unowned truth in a person, truth that was edited out to remain lovable, safe, or easy to keep. Adaptation is often mistaken for personality. Many women become skilled at it early. The skill looks like charm, ease, emotional intelligence, beauty performed at the correct temperature. Underneath, it can be a survival strategy, reading the room, smoothing conflict, staying desirable, staying chosen. None of this requires conscious deception. It is simply the psyche learning what earns protection, what earns attention, what earns a place. Over time, those rewards harden into identity. The woman becomes fluent in being palatable, and the cost of that fluency is that parts of her remain unspoken, untested, and unnamed. Then the body goes silent. The familiar stage lights dim. The roles that once provided structure, lover, muse, the reassuring presence, the one who stays attractive, lose their organizing power. Without them, the ego feels unmoored. The emptiness that follows is not the clean emptiness of meditation. It can feel like a cold draft moving through the inner house. It can feel like disappearance, because the self was once mirrored back through another's attention. When that mirror is removed, the question becomes unavoidable. What remains when no one is looking? This is where the psyche releases its oldest alarms. Time suddenly feels sharper. The mind begins calculating loss. A culture obsessed with youth has taught the feminine psyche that value is perishable and must be proven while the clock is still generous. When abstinence begins, that cultural programming does not fade politely. It demands compliance. It suggests that silence equals decline, that stillness equals waste, that the absence of pursuit is proof of becoming invisible. The ego, terrified of falling out of the market, starts manufacturing urgency. Temptation enters through that urgency. It does not arrive as something obviously destructive. It arrives as relief that costs nothing in the moment. It offers quick warmth against the chill of solitude, quick recognition against the fear of being forgotten, quick intensity against the ache of having to face oneself. It does not even have to be a person. It can be a pattern, a familiar emotional rhythm, a return to the kind of connection that provides stimulation without requiring truth. The psyche, if it has been living on external confirmation, will instinctively reach for what once made it feel real. Many return to old loops here. The return is rarely about weakness. It is about the difficulty of quiet. Loud pain at least provides drama, motion, and a storyline. Quiet pain provides no distraction and no audience. It asks the person to feel what she once outsourced. It asks her to stop treating intimacy as a sedative. It asks her to endure the raw sensation of her own inner life long enough for it to reorganize. This stage is precisely why Jung described the shadow encounter as inevitable. The ego experiences the withdrawal of its coping mechanisms as a threat to survival. Even when nothing external is actually collapsing, it will bargain, it will rationalize, it will insist that something, anything, is better than this unsettling stillness. Yet the stillness is carrying information. It reveals where hunger was mistaken for love, where attention was mistaken for safety, where being chosen was mistaken for being worthy. These confusions do not dissolve through willpower. They dissolve when they are finally seen without anesthesia. If the descent is endured consciously, abstinence begins to show its true function. It is not a retreat from life. It is a refusal to keep living at the mercy of quick relief. Something slow begins forming beneath the discomfort, a new relationship with feeling. Emotion is no longer treated as a problem to eliminate. Loneliness is no longer treated as an emergency to solve. The body is no longer treated as a bargaining chip to secure closeness. The inner world becomes a place that can be inhabited rather than escaped. Psychological maturity is rarely forged in bright moments. It is forged in private hours when the old exits are closed, when the mind offers shortcuts back to familiar suffering, and a person still chooses not to abandon herself. That choice does not look glamorous from the outside. From the inside, it is the beginning of authority, the kind that cannot be purchased by attention and cannot be taken away when the room goes quiet. Individuation, in Jung's sense, is not a motivational upgrade. It is not the glossy confidence of someone who learned better lines. It is the slow, sacred work of becoming whole, of calling home the exiled pieces, of ending the civil war inside the psyche, of no longer being dragged through life by invisible strings tied to old hunger. Individuation begins as subtraction. It removes what is false but comforting. It strips away the borrowed identities that kept a person tolerable to others while leaving her unfamiliar to herself. It is the moment the soul stops agreeing to live as a fragment. This is why abstinence can become a portal. Not because it is morally superior, not because the body is shameful, not because desire is a sin, but because abstinence interrupts the nervous system's oldest bargain, trading the inner truth for outer relief. When the body steps back from the immediate, the psyche loses a major supply line for projection. And what was being projected does not disappear. It returns like sacred fire reclaiming the center. Everything peripheral falls away until only the real can remain. Projection is the quiet habit of placing the missing piece outside the self. Safety is assigned to a partner's arms, meaning is assigned to another person's gaze, worth is assigned to being wanted. The feeling of being real is assigned to being chosen. As long as projection is fed, it feels like love. When projection is interrupted, it feels like loss. Something collapses, but it is not the self. It is the illusion that someone else was carrying the weight of your existence. At first, the gap left behind can feel like a hollow room in a house that used to be loud. The mind calls it emptiness because it is trained to fear silence. Yet beneath that fear, the deeper reality is almost tender. The psyche is clearing space, like a temple being emptied of cheap decorations before the real altar can be built, like a womb preparing for a birth that cannot happen in noise. And once that space appears, memory begins to change its language. The past no longer feels like a random sequence of heartbreaks and bad luck. It starts to arrange itself into a pattern. Old relationships reveal their hidden architecture, the same emotional rhythm, the same promise followed by the same erosion, the same hunger wearing different faces. Nights once remembered as shame begin to look like evidence. Tears once dismissed as weakness begin to look like intelligence. The unconscious has a brutal patience. It repeats the lesson until consciousness becomes mature enough to see the mechanism. That is one of the most unsettling gifts of individuation. It does not merely soothe, it reveals. It shows the thread behind the tapestry. It shows how certain choices were not choices at all, but reflexes, how certain attractions were not fate, but familiarity, how the body, in its wisdom, kept returning to the same kind of warmth because it was still trying to heal a wound it could not name. Then comes the shift that changes everything. Self-worth begins to move away from the marketplace. It is no longer measured by how much the world wants the body, how quickly someone responds, how intensely a stranger burns. A different measure appears, quieter and far more demanding, the capacity to remain present with oneself in silence. The ability to inhabit the inner house without immediately inviting someone in just to stop feeling alone. The willingness to sit with the unadorned self, without performance, without seduction, without bargaining. This is where the so-called mystical force begins to form, and it can be described without superstition. It is the force of a nervous system that is no longer starving. It is psychic energy gathered back into the center, like a flame protected from wind, till it can burn steady. When this force arrives, it rewrites the entire concept of love. Love is no longer a cure for hunger. It is no longer a drug used to numb the ache of unprocessed emptiness. It becomes companionship, two complete inner worlds walking beside each other, not two half-selves clawing for completion. Desire remains, but it is no longer a siren pulling the ship toward familiar rocks. Desire becomes a language that answers to the soul, not a leash held by fear. And this is the moment the world begins to fear her in a new way, not because she is cruel, not because she is unreachable, but because the old doors stop working. Half-love cannot enter. Promises that once sounded intoxicating now sound thin. Attention without substance cannot buy access. The woman who is becoming whole becomes a problem for anything that survives by keeping people fragmented. She is no longer easily persuaded by performance because she can feel the difference between presence and theater. What looks from the outside like a woman withdrawing is often something else entirely. A woman returning. Returning to the part of herself that was left behind in every compromise. Returning to the voice that was drowned out by wanting. Returning to the place inside where the soul does not ask to be chosen because it finally recognizes itself as home. Jung understood that the psyche does not only live in personal memories, it also lives in ancient patterns. Archetypes are those patterns, primordial forms that move beneath culture like underground rivers. One of the most misunderstood is the wild woman, not the romantic fantasy sold as rebellion, not the aesthetic of danger packaged for consumption, but the original feminine principle, instinct that does not ask permission, wisdom that does not require applause, life that does not need to be explained in order to be legitimate. Civilizations have tried to tame this force for centuries, not with chains that can be seen, but with roles that feel like safety. Lover, wife, muse, the agreeable presence, the woman who is always warm, always available, always understandable. These roles can be beautiful when chosen freely, yet they become cages when they are demanded as proof of worth. The wild woman cannot breathe inside a cage made of expectations, even when the bars are lined with compliments. When abstinence arrives as withdrawal, the original feminine has room to rise. She does not rise through speeches or declarations. She rises through boundaries that feel almost animal in their clarity, through a sharpened instinct for what is clean and what is contaminated, through selection that no longer apologizes, through the quiet power of refusal, no longer weaponized, no longer dramatic, simply true. The need to explain evaporates because the body has begun to trust its own no the way a forest trusts winter. This is where femininity becomes something the modern world has forgotten how to recognize. Not a performance of sweetness, not an endless capacity to soothe, not the art of making others comfortable. Femininity, in its original form, is presence, deep, grounded, and unbribable. It has the stillness of a lake that reflects only what is real. It has the patience of the moon that does not chase anyone, yet moves oceans. And deep presence creates disturbance because it exposes the shallow. When a woman stops offering herself as an easy mirror for other people's needs, those needs start to feel their own emptiness. When she no longer confuses being desired with being valued, the economy of desire loses leverage. The wild woman does not argue with the world. She simply stops negotiating her essence. No inner transformation survives when it hardens into extremism. A psyche that heals does not become a desert, it becomes a garden with gates. This is why abstinence in its deepest form does not demand the rejection of intimacy, the denial of love, or the punishment of the body. It demands something subtler and far more decisive, a change in the source of choice. Before integration, desire often behaves like a reflex. It rises not only from longing, but from unease, an old restlessness that believes it will die if it is not met immediately. After integration, desire does not disappear. It matures. It no longer drags the self out of alignment. The body still wants, but the wanting is not a hunger that humiliates. It becomes a language of inner consent and yes that rises from clarity rather than fear. The difference is not in the intensity of desire, but in its origin, whether it is born from lack or born from truth. This is where love stops functioning as anesthesia. When the psyche has been integrated, romance can no longer be used to numb what should be faced. A relationship cannot be worn like a coat to hide a private shame. Intimacy cannot serve as a transaction, offering access to the body in exchange for being held, being seen, being kept. These old bargains feel strangely crude once the soul has lived through silence and discovered it can survive its own depths. What once felt necessary begins to feel like self-betrayal. A beautiful paradox appears here. The capacity to love expands, yet the tolerance for what is shallow collapses. Compassion becomes stronger, but standards become sharper. The heart becomes more available, while the life becomes less negotiable. This is not hardness, It is refinement. It is the psyche learning that tenderness without discernment is not virtue. It is vulnerability without protection. And so ordinary love becomes a test, not because ordinary people are unworthy, but because ordinary patterns often rely on unconscious games. Half-promises, mixed signals, intermittent warmth, affection used as bait, desire offered as leverage. These dynamics thrive when someone is still hungry for proof, but once the hunger has been met internally, those tactics lose their power, the bait stops sparkling, the game stops entertaining. What once could hook the nervous system now feels like noise. This is why the aftermath of abstinence can look from the outside like becoming unreachable. In truth, it is becoming unbuyable. Access is no longer granted to intensity alone. Words are no longer mistaken for devotion. Chemistry is no longer crowned as destiny. The integrated woman can still desire deeply, but she does not worship desire. She places it inside a larger order where soul comes first. If love arrives after silence and arrives correctly, it does not come as a rescue mission. It comes with respect for a person who is already whole enough to walk away. It does not demand that she shrink to be held. It does not require her to perform to be chosen. It does not ask her to trade her body for belonging. It meets her at full size, in full light. Some silences resemble coldness, yet they protect embers that have not died. Embers waiting for oxygen, not applause. And some women withdraw from the world for a reason that looks invisible from the outside, not to vanish, but to end the habit of living by reflex. In Jung's depth psychology, transformation is never the reward for avoiding darkness. It is the consequence of entering it with open eyes and returning with what was left behind. When the body stops speaking through hunger, the soul begins speaking through truth. That truth is rarely gentle at first. It breaks the spell of romantic myths that once felt like destiny. It exposes the bargains that once passed as love. Yet once that truth is heard, a new standard is born. No more shrinking to earn affection. No more offering intimacy as a payment for presence. No more purchasing belonging by selling off the most sacred parts of the self. Silence becomes a boundary with meaning, a temple door that does not open for noise. A recurring dream, an unusually sharp intuition, a sudden inability to fit into places that once felt like home. Named clearly, that sign becomes an anchor, evidence that the psyche is reorganizing, not failing. This message also belongs in the hands of someone standing in that bewildering in-between, where withdrawal is misunderstood as collapse. Shared at the right time, it functions less like advice and more like a map, a way to frame discomfort as transition rather than defeat. And if you want the next chapter, subscribe, because what comes after this is not comfort, it's clarity.